Alright, now that most of our secondary forms are blocked in, we'll go into a lot of areas and start adding the final polish and tertiary bits. Still at this point, I'm using Transpose Master pretty liberally, and I really won't stop editing all the proportions until the very end. I'll keep trying to like zoom out and get fresh looks at our character just after like every small break I take and stuff like that. I also really want to stress how important it is to actually consistently zoom out and just take a look at the smaller parts you're usually working on in the context of the whole as much as possible, especially at this stage when where we're polishing and really just looking at the smaller pieces most of the time. And of course, it's like just as important to keep spinning the camera around to see what you're working on from all kinds of different angles. Um, Y'all probably hate me now because I've been zooming in and out so much and sped up into a time lapse. It's probably going to be insane. But this is just something I have to do to make sure everything's consistent and readable in the round. Even in a lot of the steps that follow, like retopo and texturing, I'll still continue to move the camera around a lot for pretty much the same reasons, and I'm really sorry. It's also important to note here that since we've stated that we're working on more of a third person point of view for our game itself, when I zoom out, I'm mostly looking at my sculpt from a regular eye level-ish kind of angle for that game camera. But if we were working on a character for like a top-down game, when I zoom out instead, I would be sort of angling the camera more to that point of view and just making sure everything works and looks juicy for that in-game camera and the player point of view. Alright, so now we're about to jump into something that I pretty much almost always save for last, I guess just out of sheer dread or something, and that's the hands. So even when I was younger and I was still just drawing like two-dimensionally, I never really practiced hands, and like I'd always find clever ways to hide them or do the old character with their hands behind their back kind of trick. And now I'm filled with regretty. So I still gotta practice a lot more sculpting hands, but maybe there's some lingering trauma from that. I don't know. But the hands for a girl are pretty simple, so I just kind of wanted a sculpt that would work, just in showing that she's pretty young and not really a fighter, so maybe less powerful, but still kind of like dexterous hands. So this skirt edit here came as a result of getting some really helpful feedback from my art director who he said he felt like the width of the skirt border was just way too thick and it made it feel almost retro gamey-ish, um, as it was in like a few other places too, but the skirt was the main offender. And a lot of the games I've worked on just over the span of my career, I guess, were like more akin to like the World of Warcraft or League of Legends kind of 3D art style, where borders and armors and those types of things tended to be more exaggerated and a lot thicker than in reality. Um, but that style has kind of faded a bit and now has a bit of a more nostalgic feeling in stylized work. Just like in all things, 3D character art has like trends that dip in and out, and it's good to be mindful of the habits you create from working in different styles over the years. Or you can just have an art director with a really good eye to catch it. But since we created our skirt border and the other problematic areas with clean geometry, it's super easy to just delete everything but that front one-sided mesh in the polygroups and just extrude a smaller thickness again. So these edits were pretty easy peasy. So here, as I'm polishing the trimmings on our big piece, I'm just adding a little bit of a line on the edges, just kind of representing some simple, stylized kind of stitching. With stitching this small, I don't really see a point in making it actual stitching unless the style really calls for it. In certain areas when I'm working in stylized, I'll exaggerate the stitches though if it's like important for them to be seen. So for instance, where the bag strap's attached to the bag, I've just enlarged the stitches there to show how they're attached. Even though it's small, I still like putting the single stitch line around the edges of cloth and leather and things like that, I feel like it just makes them feel a bit more self-contained and they have like just a bit of a border represented like they would in real life. To get a clean, smooth line like this though, um, I like to use a combination of the Orb Cracks brush and the Mech A brush with a higher lazy mouse setting. And the lazy mouse setting basically acts as a smoothing mechanism for your line to keep it nice and flowy. You can bump the lazy mouse setting up higher and higher for even more smoothing, but then the line will also get harder to control. So I recommend just starting out with it a bit low and testing things out first. So now I'm working through all the cloth folds from the ruffles on our tea brewer's dress. I really wanted to show that this was a different kind of material than the orange triangle vest thingies material, which I thought was maybe a bit more thin and perhaps satiny. And for the ruffles, I really wanted them to feel a bit thicker and puffy as a contrast. And I also wanted to make sure the large skirt was like a third, totally different cloth material as well on top of the ruffle dress. It kind of floats in this fantastical kind of way, so I wanted it to feel a bit more airy with less wrinkles in it overall. A lot of the references Ilse sent me of the skirt material seemed kind of like a thicker, less malleable material as well, like maybe there were two sheets of fabric sewn together. So I wanted to get a bit of that across too. Looking at it again now though, I think I probably should have maybe put a few more just like deeper crease lines towards the top of it, just to show that there's a bit of tension where it connects under the belt. And for this ruffled dress specifically, I'll go around and finish the creasing all throughout the ruffles, even on the back. You can't really see most of them because of the larger skirt on top, but if our girl is running and jumping around in game, there's a pretty high chance that the larger skirt might move around a bit and just show off more of that ruffle dress underneath. We'll keep the folds and stuff a bit more simple on the back just to save time, since we won't really be seeing them always, but it's good to remember to have something there just in case. So now I'm mainly just running around in cleaning areas and adding smaller tertiary details. I'm also stopping in a few places to make these little blobby accessory pieces like here. These hard surface pieces I'll eventually take into Maya and just use like a base for me to quickly model out. You can do the same thing in ZBrush itself with ZModeler now, I believe, but I think I'm just faster at modeling in Maya, so I just do a quick go Z and then back again for those bits. So like with these shoe clasp things here, I'm not trying to be super accurate or sharp with the edges at all. I'm just looking for kind of like a rough shape for me to just use as a base to bring into Maya. And then I'll just use the retopologizer to kind of go over it, but with fewer polygons. And then using that, I'll get my super like crisp edges in afterwards. While I'm doing final touches on a lot of these pieces, I'm also soloing them out just to see how the full object looks and to make sure all the geometry is looking normal from every angle. That's so that when we go to retopologizing soon, we won't be finding all kinds of unwanted surprises. This is especially important for the parts that might get animated that we can't really see clearly at the moment. For instance, the backpack cover piece, the like little flap that sits on top, it might need to open and close, or maybe it'll flap all around while she's just like jumping, running, or just maneuvering. So we want to make sure the bottom side of it doesn't look an absolute complete mess. At the same time, I'm also making sure to consider which subtools I am planning on combining in the next stage into a single mesh, and just checking to see if all of those subtools are intersecting properly all around for them to emerge together in a clean way. Before we move on, I just really quick want to touch on why I decided to poly paint her the way that I did. which might be different from other 3D artists. I've met a lot of 3D artists that prefer to drop polypaint colors onto their high poly sculpts as like an early form of texturing-ish just to visualize things. But for me personally, I've always found color super distracting and it makes it harder for me to see a lot of the different forms interacting with each other, especially the more subtle ones, since sometimes color will kind of hide sculpting mistakes and make forms read differently than how they actually are. Instead, I prefer to just color things in a grayscale kind of way, just to help me visualize things closer to the concept. A bit like how some 2D illustrators will first paint everything out in grayscale before adding gradient maps and color later. So now that we're starting to wrap everything up on the sculpt side of things, I thought it might be good to mention some of the other things we can do with this sculpt. Just if we wanted to like branch off and maybe not put her inside of a game after all. One of the reasons why I love this workflow is just because of how versatile it is. At this point, if we wanted to make her into a cute little desk figure, for instance, we could easily just pose her in ZBrush and prep her straight away for 3D printing. Or we could even take renders of that high poly pose sculpt and add some nice polypaint textures with maybe a bit of overpainting in Photoshop for some kind of 3D illustrations or look development. We could even add a bit more fidelity and get her ready for a more cinematic environment, so there's lots of stuff we can do. Sometimes if I get an idea for a project, like when I'm doing personal work, just for a vague concept or something, I can start just sculpting it out in ZBrush right away, and while I'm working it out visually, I'm also thinking about what I want it to be as an end product. But at the start, I can just be a bit more spontaneous and focus on being creative. But of course, we'll continue on and make her into a game character, so let's chug on with that. Alright, so now it's time to polish the final sculpt on our teapot companion, who we love very much, because he's completely symmetrical, which will save us a lot of time. The main things I'm keeping in mind here are just trying to be as clean as possible with all the metal pieces. It's a bit tricky because they're kind of like this in-between of like hard surface objects, but with a more organic shape. But our trim dynamic and H polish brushes helped a lot here. I was just preaching also about how you should check all around each mesh and make sure it's ready to go to the low poly stage, but I kind of goofed here and forgot how I wanted to make the large belly area a semi see-through-ish glass. So what that means is I really need to make sure the meshes surrounding the glass, specifically the contact areas, need to be clean, or else you would see all of those weird lumps and bumps and artifacts when the glass became see-through. So I had to go back and fix that later, actually, after I had started retopologizing already and got a nice little surprise. It's not the end of the world, obviously, but it is pain. Alright, so I think it's time we talk about the nest on our character's back and the journey that it went through a little bit and where it's ended up now. So even when I got the initial concept, I knew capturing the texture of the nest and translating it to 3D was going to be difficult for a bunch of reasons. Mainly because it's meant to be a framing piece for the tea kettle when it's settled and resting, meaning it should help draw the focal point of the back to the tea kettle itself and not outshine it in any way. But with so much texture, it could easily get super noisy when translated to 3D and pull that focus away. I was also thinking a lot about how to translate the texture itself, and this wasn't something I could find many stylized references to get ideas from, so I knew I would just have to wing it and try different things out. I also knew I wanted to avoid using single-sided meshes with like alphas and stuff, just as much as I could, since it would be difficult to preserve the volume of the whole thing. And just personally, I kind of don't really like how one-sided meshes look when the camera moves around and it kind of breaks the illusion. But that was my secret emergency backup. plan just in case nothing else worked out. The last thing, which wasn't much of an issue, but just something I needed to keep in mind, was that the nest needs to look like presentable, like with and without the teapot sitting inside of it. Meaning I couldn't use the teapot to kind of hide some super messy bits in the center of the nest. And that's where all the twigs and stuff kind of stem out from. So it was already a bit more prone to becoming messy in that area. So the first version of the nest was something I tried in an attempt to just kind of capture the messy look of the nest while also trying to keep the meshes as consolidated as much as I could and just not have like too many separate meshes slash subtools involved. It definitely got messy, but it was also way too spiky and the movement in it was too sharp. It was basically telling the wrong story as an asset for our characters, and it didn't look like a cozy home for our teapot companion. So I knew I needed to redo it, but I was intimidated as heck, to be honest, and I kind of avoided thinking about it until the very end. But I did learn a thing or two here on how I could structure my meshes just to get that like messy look without going nuts with the amount of meshes actually involved. So I'd say it wasn't a complete loss. For my next attempt, I wanted to try and translate things in 3D a bit more closely to Ilsa's concept, just shape-wise, but still use the consolidated mesh approach from my initial try, and I thought the end results were pretty good. Especially with our teapot sitting in the nest, I thought it helped bring some of the focus to the teapot itself, and it didn't look half bad without the teapot inside as well. I still don't think I completely nailed it, but I think I did get something I was at least more happy with under the time constraints that I had. If I had more time, though, I think I would go back and add a few more, even smaller pieces of these. Ilsa likes to call them French fries that kind of stick out all around the nest just to give it an even messier look. It's still a bit too tidy at the moment. Alright, so here is the final sculpt for our tea brewer and her teapot companion. At the point of actually creating her, I was really tired of looking at them, and I remember just only being able to see the glaring mistakes and just, the things I didn't have time to fix. But now looking back at them in post, I'm actually pretty proud of where we've gotten to. And yeah, I think we did a good job actually, and I think that's mostly attributed to just all the help and support that I've gotten from the Envar team.